Okay, we should be good. So today we're going to talk about EEGNet, and then emphasis on if we have time, I'll talk a little bit more about what was actually on the syllabus for today, which is some more project considerations and hardware issues. But this week I have been very bad at estimating how long I spend on things, so we might just talk about EEGNet. Well, I will strip a little bit of time at the end to talk about projects just because we'll release the midterm proposal. And I did put up the past projects from the last couple of years. So I'll go over that spreadsheet at the end of class. But we'll start with EEGNet. I guess before that, does anybody have any logistics questions or questions in general, previous material, before we get started? Good? Well, if you think of anything, feel free to raise your hand, drop it in chat, and we can go over it. As a reminder, in case I forget, the fourth assignment is going to be due on Monday, not Sunday. That was just because it was delayed in being released, but I would still advise getting started earlier than later if you haven't already started it. We've been getting a lot of good questions in office hours, so feel free to stop by those. I know I have them today at 11. But yeah, and it is the last assignment, so we're almost done. I think all of my extensions are done for assignment 1, 2, and 3, so I think we'll just release all of those at the same time, probably like today or tomorrow, in terms of the answers and the key and stuff, so keep an eye out for that. Sorry, this week's been delayed on things that I've wanted to pump out because we're doing interviews within our department, and me and the TAs have been involved in that and meeting prospective grad students and hosting events and stuff, so it has been time-consuming. Okay, so today we'll talk about EEGNet. I'm not going to take a super detailed approach into it, but we will talk about the meat of what EEGNet is, sort of how it performs, why it makes sense, how it works to some extent. But it's, this is not a deep learning class, and I know a lot of people don't come in with a machine learning background, so I want to make it as accessible as possible. So what EEGNet is, it's a convolutional neural network. It's relatively small for a deep learning network, but it is still a convolutional neural network. It's very efficient, and what the goal of this was, unlike a transformer today, which is trying to be some generalized all-in-one platform, EEGNet was designed pretty intentionally to work with EEG data and to do very specific things. And it's useful for doing an all-in-one pipeline of processing EEG data. So it can learn temporal filters, it can learn spatial filters, and it can also extract those filters and then classify them. So in this class, we've talked about things like just applying bandpass filters to our data. We've talked about common spatial patterns to apply spatial filters. We've talked about linear discriminant analysis for actually doing that classification. EEGNet sort of packages all of those things into this deep learning framework and does all of them for you. And how it's going to perform is going to be variable, right? So it's not necessarily going to be as easy to understand or tune individual parameters with a neural network as it would be to tune parameters in a standard non-deep pipeline, right? Because if we want to make modifications to which band things are being filtered in, we just change 2 values, right? So it's like, okay, we want a 0.1 to 30 hertz bandpass filter. We can just change those numbers. Oh, maybe we want to use an IIR filter instead of an FIR filter. We can just change that. But we don't necessarily have that level of control or granularity over what the network is going to be learning. So although it can do all of these things all in one, we don't necessarily have the same level of control or understanding of what's exactly happening afterwards. Now, what makes EEGNet different than some of these black box approaches to deep learning is that because the features it's learning are done so in this very systematic, layered approach, we can actually look at what's happening at each step to see that things look somewhat reasonable. So we'll talk about all of the layers individually, but the first one's going to be learning some temporal filter, and we can actually look at what happens to the data as a result of that temporal filter to confirm that it actually is learning these band passes. And then the penultimate layer is a spatial filter, and we can actually plot the topo plots just like we would see in CSP to make sure that it is learning reasonable spatial filters. So it's not something that is completely opaque to us. We can at least observe what the results are after training. But again, if you want to make these slight modifications, it's not an optimal choice for that. And what's cool about EEGNet is it doesn't just work for one thing. So it's not just designed for ERPs, or even it's not just designed for the P300 or the late positive potential or whatever. It works on ERPs, it works on motor imagery. It's sort of an all-in-one processing pipeline that also works for a lot of different signals. Now, there have been researchers that have taken this architecture and have modified it to work better for certain things. So like, the Dassault lab, they have made modifications to EEGNet to work better with motor imagery, for example. And there's other labs that do similar things to make them better for ERPs and make some modifications to make it classify, different things or emphasize different filters. So, but EEGNet is definitely a good all-in-one generalized thing, and it's something that you could theoretically modify for a project, right? So if you were interested in making small performance changes to EEGNet and seeing how that responds to a certain data set, that's a very good project. We've had students do that. We've had students even do that and then continue doing research with the lab and write papers about it. So, or conference papers typically, but still. So it's a very rich and relatively new field of study. So if this is your cup of tea, I will encourage you going down that rabbit hole. So before we get started about the details of EEGNet, I'll talk a little bit about just the basics of artificial neural networks. And I'm not going to be referencing these videos necessarily, but they're very good to watch if you're the kind of person that likes learning from videos. Obviously, I think 3 blue, 1 browns is probably the most popular. And even when I was an undergrad and I took COGS 118A, the instructor played part of that video when we started covering neural networks, which is kind of a hilarious moment. It's like, why am I in class to watch a YouTube video? I already do that for fun. But it is a very good video. And the other two I've watched, I can recommend less, but they are still good. The last one is actually a series, so you can sort of take it into smaller chunks and actually implement a neural network, rather than just like 3 blue, 1 brown's video is very theoretical and has beautiful visualizations. But at the end of it, you might not necessarily actually be able to have a working neural network, whereas the other 2 videos, that's the whole point of them, is like actually just load it, go into Python, don't use TensorFlow, don't use sklearn, just implement a neural network. And that's a great way to learn what's actually happening. Okay, so this is going to be a very summarized and non-exhaustive explanation of an artificial neural network. But essentially, we have some set of inputs that are going to be the very first thing in the network, right? We need inputs for pretty much anything we're doing algorithmically. Typically, people explain this in the context of image processing. So in this case, all of your inputs would be the different pixels that are in an image. And this is not just a 2-dimensional thing that gets flattened. It has multiple dimensions, right? All of our colors have 3 or 4 channels or more, depending on your format. But typically, that's, you're going to have, let's say you have a 32 by 32 image. You would multiply those out so it's 1-dimensional, and then you have that times 3 number of total features. But typically, those are stacked. So these are like 3-dimensional inputs. With EEG, we have something similar where we have multiple time points within a certain epoch. So typically, we're training on individual observations. So we wouldn't necessarily feed an algorithm all of our EEG data that we've recorded, like the 30-minute session or something. We would still do the approach that we do in these normal analyses where we take some event that's occurred or take some small chunk of data, and we feed those as individual observations for the network to train on. And so in this case, our flattened data are just time points, and our additional dimension is our channel space. So just like images have R, G, and B, we have, FZ, FCZ, FP1, whatever. We have any number of potential channels. And essentially, the whole magic behind a neural network is you take these inputs, and the inputs are connected to some additional set of layers. And these layers are connected to each other with different weights, okay, which we can represent by this matrix W. And the whole goal is to learn the ideal weights for the connections of these matrices in order to get some sort of prediction. So in the case of images, for example, maybe you're doing digit recognition. So you're feeding it a bunch of images, and the whole point is to try to make these weights learn individual features, like let's say the top loop of a 9 and the straight edge of a 9, something like this, in order to output some confidence that it's either the zero number, number 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, all the way to 9. When it comes to something like EEGNet and classifying EEG data, often what we want is we want it to be able to determine between some number of different classes that are not necessarily like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but more like, okay, that was a target or a non-target, or there was left-hand motor imagery or right-hand motor imagery or tongue motor imagery or foot motor imagery. But the goal is still the same. We're still applying some set of processes where we're trying to learn the weighting of these individual connections from neuron to neuron, that's what the little circles are called, such that when we give the network an input, it's able to reliably classify that input into its correct class. Those aren't the only types of neural networks. There's, some of you might have heard of generative adversarial networks that are actually generating things rather than just classifying them. But in this case, EEGNet is not trying to do that. It's not trying to give you synthetic EEG data. It's trying to just take existing data and just tell you which class it thinks that data belongs to. So you need to give it some prior knowledge. It needs to know how many classes there are, for example. And yeah, they're really not that complicated from a, if you think about it as just a way of learning individual weighting values between different connections. And of course, this can get very complicated very quickly in terms of whether or not layers are fully connected, or if neurons within additional layers are laterally connected to each other, and if whatever. But for the sake of this, learning weights is all that matters. And I'm not even going to talk about like activation functions or anything. So ask me questions about that if you're interested. But it's not super pivotal to understanding the broad concepts. Oh, I lost my notes for this. Okay. I'm gonna have to freestyle then. I don't know what happened to my notes. So what we have here on the left is similar to this representation that I showed earlier, which is a standard sort of neural network. What we do in EEGNet is they have these depthwise convolutional neural networks, which essentially allows you to have you can have these layers that are not fully connected, and so you don't have to learn as many weights. This is the key thing. If you have to learn all of these individual connections from neuron to neuron, layer to layer, you end up think of each of these values as individual parameters. And as you can imagine, as the number of neurons in each layer gets larger and larger, the number of connections, increases exponentially. And you can very quickly have just an unbelievable number of parameters that you have to learn on. And if you haven't taken machine learning classes or like 109 or something, one thing that you always want to keep in mind is the more parameters you have, the more variance you have, and the more likely you are to be overfitting on a certain set of data. So if you have a lot of parameters, but you have just an absolute metric ton of data, then you can overcompensate because you have so many observations and let's say you have such a good chunk of what the true distribution of your data are, you're not going to be as likely to overfit, right? Because you have such a good representation. So having that many parameters, but on an almost true representation of the data, means that you're actually going to be learning real structure in the network. So think about the really complicated language models like this that are trained on like the entire internet as inputs. Those models have like hundreds of billions of parameters that they can learn, and they can get away with that because they have so much data. But when we're dealing with something like EEG data, there are not that many public data sets. It's very expensive to collect more EEG data, and so we can't risk having these over-parameterized networks, and it's important to take certain tricks that make it easier to reduce those numbers of parameters. So depthwise convolutional neural networks are one way of making it so that there are fewer parameters that you need to train, which is less likely to be overfitting on the data. That's the main takeaway. And I feel like I have more slides on this somewhere later, so we'll save that for then. But okay, let me start explaining each of the layers. So the first one is just the input, and the authors very clearly demonstrate that by just showing us raw EEG data. And the input size is C by T, where C is just the number of channels. It's just shorthand for that. And T is the number of time points. And this ends up getting reshaped to be three-dimensional into a 1 by C by T. But this is very standard. This is how you would start with any sort of analysis pipeline, right? We get our input data. Now, again, I want to emphasize that this is not all of the continuous data. This is going to be a chunk of data. It's going to be an epoch. And depending on the signal that you're trying to analyze, you might have a different length epoch. So with the P300, for example, we can get away with seeing samples a few hundred milliseconds before and maybe up to 600 milliseconds after a response. Well, you could, make that a second or something. So you can capture the true signal within that data in a relatively short period of time. But if you're working with something like sensory motor imagery, these tend to be over much larger spans of time, maybe 2 seconds, 2.5 seconds, 3 seconds. So the actual length of the input is going to be different depending on what you're trying to classify. But that's why I'm using this notation of channel by time point, and I'm not giving you exact numbers of, it's going to be 64 by 20,000, right? Because it's going to be affected not only by the length of your epoch, but also with the sampling rate, right? Because the higher the sampling rate, the more samples we have in a certain amount of time. Okay, and now the first layer is just a standard convolutional neural network, which is similar to what I showed you guys on the first slide, where you have all of these inputs just going into to the next layer. It's densely connected. And the goal of this first layer is to learn temporal filters. And again, we can see the output of those filters. So we can see, in the first one, we have this slower oscillation. In the second one, we have this very high frequency oscillation. Maybe this is something in 30 hertz or something, some muscle signal, whatever. And then this is assuming there's the ... is just saying, we have some number of temporal filters we're learning. And this is what a hypothetical last temporal filter would learn. In the case of this paper, they actually they explored the performance of EEGNet in 2 different sets. Well, technically 3, but you'll often see it as like EEGNet hyphen number 1, comma number 2. That first number is the number of temporal filters. So like EEGNet 4.2 or EEGNet 8.2, that means EEGNet with 4 temporal filters or EEGNet with 8 temporal filters. And this is a very similar approach to what we're doing in homework 4, actually, where we're taking multiple different filter banks, right? So we have this, in the homework, I think we have 11 different banks of filters that we're learning. And it's just going to be, those are just going to be regular bandpass filters, like 0.1 to 3, 3 to 5, whatever. This first layer of EEGNet is the equivalent of that, where it's saying, okay, I'm going to learn a set of temporal filters. And that's what's, all of our data are going to be processed through that, and then they'll all go through the next step, all within their own temporal filter, which is very similar to what we're doing in homework 4, if you go through and actually understand what's happening in that main for loop. And in this case, the size of our filter is going to be F1, which is just the number of filters, number of temporal filters, by 1 by half of the sampling rate. And the reason you use half of the sampling rate is in order to, it's a way of dealing with aliasing, which we talked about when we talked about filtering. So the Nyquist theorem says that you can only accurately represent data that is half of the sampling rate. So by saying that you're only going to learn a filter size of half the sampling rate, this is a way of essentially explicitly dealing with the fact that you don't want to alias any signals that are larger than that. They say something in the paper about the representation in lower frequencies being limited by this as well, but I don't quite understand that. So don't ask me questions about that, because I don't know. But I need to spend some time to figure out what they mean by that. But the upper limit is definitely, like the total length of the filter on the upper limit is definitely to deal with anti-aliasing. And then the size of the output filter is just going to be, the output of this layer is going to be the number of filters. So let's say this is either 4 or 8 by the number of channels by the number of time points. So the number of time points and the number of channels have still been preserved. But now, rather than being a 1 by C by T, it's the number of temporal filters, which makes sense because think of these as all individual pipelines that are still going to be merged at the end, which is slightly better than a filter bank approach that we take with something like CSP, where all of our data is processed independently of each other in these different frequency bands. So one of the benefits of a network is that at the end, they can all be, squishified into something that's larger than the sum of its whole, which we don't necessarily get with a linear approach with a filter bank common spatial patterns, for example. Okay, so the second layer is going to be learning spatial filters. And these are exactly the same. Well, they're not guaranteed to be the same that we learned from CSP, but the point is the same, which is let's look in this channel dimensional space and see which channels contribute to extracting certain features the best. And again, it should be clear, well, hopefully it should be clear now that this combo approach of first learning temporal filters, now learning these spatial filters is inspired greatly by the filter bank common spatial patterns, which is, again, exactly what we're doing in A4. And the authors even say, this approach was influenced by filter bank common spatial patterns. So it's not exactly the same as CSP because we're not doing this eigenvalue decomposition and picking the first k eigenvectors and the bottom k eigenvectors and using that to separate our classes. Instead, we choose a number of spatial filters. In this case, they look at 2, which means that for every temporal filter, they're going to be learning 2 spatial filters. So in total, you have, let's say if you have 4 temporal filters, and at the end you'll have 16 total spatial filters. So you end up having, the number of spatial filters you have is going to be larger than what we would normally choose in CSP, where we would take like the top 3 and the bottom 3. So it's not exactly the same process, but it is inspired by that philosophy of, okay, we have useful temporal information, we have useful spatial information, let's extract that, and then they have this additional step where they get to combine that at the end. And this layer is a depthwise conv layer, which I think now I have my notes on. But again, the whole point is that the layers are not fully connected, which means you can reduce the number of parameters and reduce the likelihood of overfitting. So this is an example. This assumes that we're dealing with images. So we have this source thing, which is obviously 3-dimensional. I think they're even colored. My presentation view is very small. But yeah, so they're colored. So RGB. And in a regular convnet, in a depthwise convnet, you can actually use the fact that each of these channels are, they're part of the same data. They're just multi-dimensional. So they have this depth equal to C, which is the number of channels. I don't know what the best way to explain this without making it confusing is. I'm going to keep it at the simple explanation that the point of this is to reduce the number of parameters. If you would like to learn more, come to my office hours, ask questions on Piazza, read the paper. I just don't want to muddy the water. But yeah, no, I'm just gonna skip it. So the very final thing that EEGNet does, again, which is an advantage over our standard processing pipeline, is that it will actually merge all this information together. So this is a separable depthwise convolution layer, which I'll provide links under the slides to good tutorials explaining this as well. But you can think of this as a way of just summarizing the temporal activity, and it does this with these 500 millisecond chunks, which is why this formula is weird for temporal filtering. The reason why the sampling rate is divided by 4 is because in a previous processing step, they actually do a 4 times downsampling of the data. So you take 1/4 of the sampling rate, multiply that by 500 because they're looking at 500 millisecond chunks, and then divide that by 1,000 in order to get the total number of filters, like the total dimensionality of the data. And then once we've done this temporal summarization approach, we then do a pointwise filter, which is just a 1-by-1, which summarizes the information across all of the previous feature maps, across all of the previous layers, to get everything into this, final stage that we can then use to output as like our classification. So this is not only an additional summarization step, but it's the aggregation step of our previous information. It takes the temporal filters, the spatial filters that we learned, and merge all of those together so that we can now perform classification. And really the easiest way is to just think of it as a combination step. And then the final classification stage is going to just be size n, which is the total number of classes that you have. So again, if you're doing 4-class motor imagery, the n would be 4. If you're just trying to do a P300 where it's either target or non-target, this is just going to be 2. And you can modify that depending on your particular task. So again, that's the nice thing about EEGNet, is that it's flexible to the type of data that you're giving it, and it performs pretty well on multiple different data sets. So as I've been talking about the number of parameters a lot, and just to put it into perspective, here are some naive convolutional neural networks, so the deep ConvNet and the shallow ConvNet, and you can just see, we have orders of magnitude fewer parameters with EEGNet 4.2 and EEGNet 8.2. And the reason, again, why these different signals have different lengths and different numbers of parameters is because you need more time to get these signals. So actually, for the feedback error-related negativity, which is the second row, you could have made it the same length as the P300. I don't really know why they chose a longer time point. But the point of this is just to show how fewer parameters there are for EEGNet over something like a naive neural network. And then they also plot the approach, the area under the curve. So if you remember from assignment 3, the area under the curve that we're getting here is from the ROC curve, which again refer to assignment 3 to remember what that is. But this is a way to measure the performance of the classifier without biasing it to a specific set of training data. So you typically do this within like some form of cross-validation, and it's a slightly better metric than just looking at the raw accuracy or the loss of training. So you'd run cross-validation, and rather than just calculating accuracy or loss, you calculate the area under the ROC, which is essentially plotting the false positive rate against the true positive rate. So it's a slightly better metric for the performance of your classifier in general. And in this case, we have 4 different plots. The first 3 are different ERPs, which is why they're in their own category. And then the one that's by itself is motor imagery. And we can see that, we compare it to different approaches. So XDAWN, think of XDAWN as the ERP equivalent of common spatial patterns. So you're trying to learn these spatial filters that maximize the difference between these ERP classes, which are not varying in the same way as motor imagery, which CSP is very ideal at discriminating. So that's why they separate it as well. And that's why in the case of the figures on the left, the dark purple is XDAWN, and then on the figure on the right, the dark purple is filter bank CSP. It's because they're essentially the closest equivalent to each other, except one is in ERP space and one is in motor imagery space. And we can see that in general, EEGNet performs quite well. It tends to perform better than the over-parameterized networks. So, for example, in the motor imagery sense, the deep ConvNet actually performs the worst. The shallow ConvNet performs very well, and EEGNet 8.2 performs very well. But what's interesting is that if we look at filter bank CSP, that also performs quite well still. And this is a trend in a lot of different deep learning studies on EEG data, is that our linear approaches, like using standard filters and LDA or support vector machines, tend to still outperform these deep learning approaches, even though the deep learning has way more parameters and is way fancier, it can learn these nonlinear things. But there are also cases where you can get advantages from these nonlinearities. I'm going to have either Mata or Professor Dessau talk about one way to accomplish that in order to make like the deep learning models significantly better than naive filter bank CSP. But yeah, in general, they perform quite well. And again, I was mentioning this, but what's really nice about this approach is that you can actually visualize the spatial filters. So in the top, we see these topo plots, which we saw when we were looking at the CSP paper. And again, what it's plotting is the relative contribution. In this case, it's in a gradient map, but think of it as the approximate contribution of every individual electrode on the discriminability of that signal. On the bottom, and we haven't looked at these plots before in class, but this is known as a time frequency plot. So we can see that on the x-axis we have time, just like we'd have on an ERP plot where we have our nice little waveform. On the y-axis we have frequency, and in this case, let me make sure this is not some weird base 2 thing again, but yeah, just frequency from 2.4 to 32 hertz. In this case, 32 is the highest frequency because they recorded at 128 hertz and they downsampled it 4 times down to 32. And then the color represents the actual power at those different frequencies. And so what a time frequency plot is very good at showing us is not only which frequencies are relevant in our signal, but at which times they become relevant. So there's a whole set of analyses in the time frequency domain. There are literal books. There are people whose whole careers are dedicated towards teaching and moving this side of the field forward. But in this case, it's very clear to see, for example, as time in the very first plot within B, we can see that at about 500 milliseconds, we see this very strong increase in low frequencies, which means that this filter bank was almost certainly the one that learned these lower frequency representations. We can see that the one above it learns slightly higher frequency representations. The one next to it learns the highest frequency representations, and it's minimizing frequencies and also some high frequencies. So it's a combination, again, of the temporal and spatial information because of the nature of EEGNet. But the goal of this is we can see it, and we can, as experimenters, we have knowledge about what these ERPs and these different activations should look like, and we can use this to evaluate if our network is actually performing in a way that is somewhat plausible. And in this case, these all look very biologically plausible. So the topo plots look like they'd be standard spatial filters. There's no emphasis over ocular electrodes, for example, which might indicate that there are blinks. And you'd think that this, well, I don't know what you guys would think, but some researchers don't understand how to actually analyze these images. Like, you can very clearly tell who is just a deep learning researcher and has no EEG experience. I've literally reviewed papers where people are applying deep learning and they're saying, oh, we've created this super awesome approach to have these interpretable deep learning networks, and then they'll show topo plots, and their topo plots very clearly show like blink artifacts. And they're like, wow, look how good our spatial filter is at learning these like features. And it's like, dude, like literally my second day undergrads at my lab at SDSU like can identify that that is a blink artifact. So the EEGNet authors are not so foolish. They're obviously trained in analyzing EEG data, and the things that they're showing are very convincingly non-artifactual. Like these look very neural and very plausible. And this is something that you learn with experience. It's not necessarily obvious at first glance, and that's why it's important to have some domain knowledge in the signals that you're classifying on. So again, if you are interested in going more in the machine learning space with EEG data or neural data in general, it is never a waste of time to learn more about the methods and the experimentation behind the data you're working with so that you can better understand your signals. I mean, I know a lot of data scientists especially fall into this trap where they get really good at their general set of processing steps and they don't take enough time to get domain knowledge for the data they're actually working with. And that is a huge mistake. And people will catch you eventually, even if people don't catch you eventually, or like initially. So that is a representation from EEGNet 4.2. And then here's one with EEGNet 8.2. This is a different data set, so the topo plots have a different set of channels. And in this case, this was from 4.1. So they're learning one spatial filter per class. I think I put that on the thing. Yeah, 4.1. This one is a motor imagery data set, and it's 8.2, which means we're learning 8 temporal filters. And for each temporal filter, we're learning 2 spatial filters. And again, we can see that the first one are these slower oscillations. The second one is like some nested oscillation that's still slow but has these maybe like higher frequency bursts. Third one is much higher frequency, and then the ones after they tend to have less information. And what you'd anticipate is that if you were to actually peer into the network and look at the weights, you'd hope to see some way that like everything after filter 3 is sort of just like really down-weighted. Like, yeah, we learn these things, but this information is not really useful. And again, the spatial filters look normal. They're a little weirder than CSP filters, but if we like look at the first one, we can see that it's lateralized, so we see more of a right hand. If we look at the second filter, it's more towards the left hand. So there's some hemispheric differences, which is not uncommon. I mean, that's sort of the goal of what we get in common spatial patterns and stuff. So again, these look all very neurologically plausible. The filter responses look very sensible to what you'd get from if you're trying to do like ICA or something and separate 10 hertz and beta frequency and stuff like that. So yeah, EEGNet's cool. I think this is my last slide on that, which is good because I'll have time to talk about project stuff, but any questions before I move on to that? Yes?
So are the spatial filters that you show under the temporal filter only acting on the data from that temporal filter?
Exactly.
It's not like cross-coupling through.
Yes. So the question was, if you take an individual column of this image, is it the case that the spatial filters are only acting on the data right above it, so like this temporal filter? And that's exactly what's happening. So for every temporally filtered signal, 2 spatial filters are being learned. And again, at the very last step, this aggregation step, is when all of this information is being merged into one useful sort of married set of signals. But at the individual steps of learning, so that you take all the data, learn temporal filters, and then for each of those temporal filters, you learn spatial filters. And that's actually also what we're doing in assignment 4, where for each individual filter bank, we're learning a set of common spatial patterns, which is why that algorithm takes so long, is we're looping across subjects, across folds, and then across 11 filter banks, which are all doing CSP. So that analysis takes like 5 minutes because it is actually doing a lot of processing, even if the processing steps individually are not that complicated. Good question. Cool. All right, if you guys have questions later, office hours, Piazza, happy to answer. I think Srini knows EEGNet as well, so he'll be able to answer the questions. Ina and Q, I don't know if you guys had previous experience. Yeah. So come to my office hours or Srini if you want more detailed things, since I think we've read these papers more recently. I read this paper every year, technically, but I'll read it. I'm supposed to have read it every year. But okay, so let's go into, let's see.